Good morning, everyone. Good morning, scholars. How are we doing today? Excellent. So I'm going to bring up Mr. C shortly. He'll introduce our guests. Today we have a special assembly that we only invited our junior class, primarily because it ties into the curriculum that you're learning. So just a couple of things. Please put away your cell phones, right? We want to give our guests your undivided attention. And this is a memorable experience. So sit back, listen, enjoy, right? Without any further, Mr. C.
Good morning, junior class. So September 11th, 2001 was a solemn day that has become an important part of the history that we teach. This year, as in years past, thanks to a partnership with our local historical society and the Eastchester Rotary Club, we have local community members who have a close connection to the events of 9/11 that will speak with you. This is in preparation for your trip next week to the 9/11 Mobile Museum, which will be at Lake Isle Country Club. So there'll be more information to come on that trip. So this morning, I just want to do brief introductions. We have Mr. Forliano. We could welcome him, please. Mr. Alan Benedict. Ms. Carrie Foley. Mr. Paul Ranalone. And Ms. Andrea Rayner. So each of these individuals will speak with you about their experiences in dealing with 9/11 and their experiences around that event in our history. I would also like to thank our superintendent, Dr. Goodman, is here with us, So Dr. Goodman, as the leader of our district, ensures that we as a district never forget the sacrifices that were made around 9/11, so we thank Dr. Goodman for that. At this time, I would like to welcome Mr. Alan Benedict, who will give some introductory remarks before we get to our first speaker. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrew, and welcome, students. Mr. Forliano is our town historian, and he and I are representing the Rotary Club this morning. Early on the morning of September 11th, 2001, 4 planes took off from 3 different airports. Excuse me. Well, when they got into the air, they were immediately hijacked by terrorists. The first plane, which took off from Logan Airport in Boston, came around into New York City and crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center at 8:46 in the morning. The second plane, also taking off from Logan Airport, again headed into New York and crashed into the South Tower at 9:03 that morning. Within 2 hours, both of those towers had imploded, killing nearly 3,000 people, including 343 firemen who had responded to that event for rescue purposes. A third plane took off from Newark Airport and was headed for the Capitol building in Washington. But the passengers of that plane took over from the terrorists and crashed the plane into Shanksville, Pennsylvania, killing everybody aboard. And the fourth plane took off from Washington, circled around and crashed into the Pentagon, killing nearly 200 people. That kind of sets the stage for that day. In 2014, this behind you, you'll see the 9/11 Never Forget Mobile Museum was spurred on by the Siller family. If I have time later, I will tell you more about the Siller family. So the Tunnel to Towers program is the sponsor of this 9/11 Mobile Museum. To kind of better prepare you for your visit next week, these 3 folks will tell you their personal experience. Carrie is a 1991 graduate. She knows this assembly well, and she will speak, followed by retired Lieutenant Paul Ranalone from the Eastchester Fire Department, who is also a member of the Board of Fire Commissioners in Eastchester. The Reverend Andrea Rayner is a chaplain with the Rye Fire Department, and she spent many, many months down at what became known as the Pile, helping people get through the day. So Carrie will be the first to speak. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you. Alan is my dad. And like he said, I'm a 1991 graduate of Tuckahoe High School, so it's nice to be back. And I'm here to tell you how 9/11 affected my family. I was married to Danny Foley, a New York City fireman, and his brother was also a New York City fireman. So on 9/11, that morning, I happened to be down at Twin Lakes Farm riding horses, and we got a phone call down there saying a plane hit the Trade Center. So my trainer said, "You better go home." And I went home, and my husband was up watching the news, and he said, "I know Tommy is working." He happened to not be working, my husband. So he said, "I'm leaving right now." All across the bottom of the TV on the news, it was an alert saying, "All New York City firemen, report to your firehouses." So he said, "I'm leaving." We said goodbye, and he went down to Rescue 3. Rescue 3 is where Tommy was stationed, and Danny was actually on light duty. So he had had an injury, and he was working in the RAC unit, which is like a recovery unit for firemen. So he was working on that unit. He went right to Rescue 3, and by the time he got there and got down to what was then the pile, he was starting to look for his brother and the rest of the firemen that were on the truck. He knew they had left, he knew they were down there, and he knew there was not a lot of hope that we would find Tommy and the 6 others that went down on the truck. So they spent many days searching, trying to recover, rescue, find anybody surviving, find bodies, find body parts. Very, very dismal, sad experience. We all kind of took up camp, so to speak, at Danny and Tommy's parents' house in Rockland. Danny's cousin is a fireman in West Palm Beach in Florida. His brother-in-law was a fireman in Mount Vernon. His father was on New York City Sanitation Department, and they would go down to Rescue 3 and then to the pile in shifts, kind of like 2 to 3 day shifts. Come back to the house in Rockland, give us an update, take showers, wash their clothes, and go back down and work. And Danny's main goal was to find his brother. He told his parents he would bring his brother home. About 10 days later, he found him. And not a lot. They identified him with a screw from a knee surgery, from x-rays and MRIs. But he got a lot of closure in being able to find him that a lot of people didn't get. So on our 1-year wedding anniversary, they confirmed that in fact that was Tommy that was found. We started going to a lot of funerals. They found some, not all, not everybody who was killed. So we had funerals right away. There were funerals going on for years. During that time, my husband Danny continued to work at Ground Zero at the pile. And in 2019, he was diagnosed with 9/11 related pancreatic cancer. And a year later, he died. So, thank you. His parents had both died by then. His mother died in 2014 and his father in 2016. But after 9/11, his mother worked at the Tribute Center, which was down right by Ground Zero, and she was giving tours. She did not want her son's memory forgotten. She would give tours, and it was very important to her to educate kids because you guys were not alive when this happened. So she really wanted to know, she really wanted students and adults to know what happened and to really see how it affected people. And we had created a golf outing and a scholarship in memory of my brother-in-law, Tommy. And with that fundraising, we started bringing the Tunnel to Towers Museum around to schools as well. And this was really important to my mother-in-law, Pat. And after Tom died, my father-in-law, my husband, and my sister-in-law, Joanne, wanted to keep that going. So we kept the museum coming around to schools to have you learn about the experience. So since Danny has died in 2020, we're still helping to bring the museum around, and our golf outing has now changed to in memory of both Tommy and Danny. So we try to keep the memory alive, and we try to educate the kids about how this event that happened in one day is still affecting people today. People are being diagnosed with cancer, physical ailments, mental ailments, work-related disabilities, a lot of issues that affect their life. We have 5 children. They know a lot about 9/11. They've been to a lot of memorials. They've seen a lot of videos. They've heard a lot of talk about Danny and Tommy, and we're just here trying to make sure everyone is educated and everyone knows what happened that day and knows that it's still affecting everyone to this day. So I hope you enjoy the museum when you come on Tuesday. I should be around as well, and I think at the end we'll take questions if you have any. And on Tuesday, hopefully I'll see you there and take some questions too.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I happened to be off duty on September 11, 2001. I was working in my family business at the time, and a little after 9 o'clock, my sister came into work, and she said, a small plane has been reportedly hit the World Trade Center. I really didn't think much of it at the time because I remembered that just after World War II, a B-25 bomber had crashed into the Empire State Building. And although a half a dozen or so people had been killed, nothing else happened to the building. It didn't fall down or anything, and there were no other lives lost. So it wasn't until several hours later that I found out the extent of what happened. Does anybody here like to write essays and stand in front of an audience and speak? I didn't think so. I certainly don't. But this is the one thing that I do every year. And I'll get to it. From Wednesday, September 12, 2001, through Sunday, September 16th, the Eastchester Fire Department sent a fully manned engine and ladder company to cover Bronx firehouses or to stand by at Yonkers Raceway for deployment. I was at Station 1 and remember feeling worried for these mutual aid companies, not knowing what might happen to them. On Thursday, September 13th, Mount Vernon Fire Department Local 107, in conjunction with the Westchester Professional Firefighters Coalition, was able to contact officials in New York City in order to organize a relief effort. After getting approval to do so, they contacted all professional firefighter unions in Westchester. In a matter of a few hours, 120 firefighters from all over Westchester met at Mount Vernon Fire Department Station 3. Included in that number were 10 firefighters from Eastchester. 2 EFD members were able to get 3 buses at no cost. Shortly before 7 p.m., the buses left Mount Vernon with a state police escort to Manhattan. Almost from the time we turned onto the West Side Highway, people lined both sides of the street with signs and flags. Many thanking us and cheering. Signs read, "God bless you, and you're our heroes." The buses parked off Hudson Street on Beach Street. Upon arrival, all firefighters were organized into 10-man companies with either a lieutenant or captain in charge. I took command of the Eastchester contingent. We walked from the buses to the staging area, 1 block, what has become known as Ground Zero, but to the rescuers was the pile. Along the way, people on the sidewalk clapped and thanked us, offered us water, food, gloves, masks, and anything else we might need to do our work. Walking along, we could see and smell the smoke from what was once the World Trade Center. At the staging area, we saw an engine and ladder truck on a side street. The truck's aerial was mangled and bent over the cab. That truck is in the museum down at the Trade Center site. The engine was recognizable only by the front part of the cab where the driver and officer would sit. Everything else had been crushed to about 5 feet high. On the officer's door, someone had written, "In memory of the lieutenant and firefighters who had apparently all been killed." After getting permission to proceed, we passed a parking lot filled with burnt-out cars. We stood in front of 3 World Financial Center, now used as a rest and rehab station. Construction workers cut up the fallen North Bridge in preparation to move it out of the way in order to gain access to the main area of debris behind it with heavy equipment. We walked between 3 and 4 World Financial Center along the Winter Garden atrium and into 2 World Financial Center to the front entrance on West Street. From this point, we got an unobstructed view of the massive destruction. From this entrance to 2 World Trade Center, a distance of about 500 feet, were steel box beams lying parallel about 3 feet apart on top of 10 to 15 feet of concrete and other pulverized debris. There were several hundred rescuers in about a dozen bucket brigades removing debris from around the 7-story stump of the tower and passing it down to the front of the financial center, where it was dumped and the empty buckets returned to the front of the line. Iron workers cut up steel beams, which would be passed down the line and thrown on the pile. We filled in on several of these lines, balancing ourselves on the box beams. In some areas, you could look through the rubble and see the remains of a fire truck or ambulance. Several of our firefighters attempted to tunnel beneath the box beams in order to look for victims below us. Every so often, someone would yell to be quiet. The generators and power tools would be shut down, and everyone would stop working and just listen for any sounds from the debris pile. After a minute or so, work would continue. Looking up and around from the middle of Ground Zero gave a clear view of the destruction. Every window facing the Twin Towers had been blown out, and chunks of buildings had been gouged out from falling debris. The sides of the remaining buildings were covered in a thin coat of powder that could be seen floating in the air through the glow of floodlights. It was several inches thick for many blocks around the site. Despite the hard work, early Friday morning it got noticeably cooler, and about 2 a.m. it started to rain. A drizzle at first. Suddenly it started getting heavy, making footing treacherous, and since we were working in T-shirts, the rain just made us wetter and more uncomfortable. An FDNY chief officer called off operations, and our chief officers decided it was time to go back. So we picked up our gear and headed back to the buses. On the buses, we were tired, cold, and wet. There was little, if any, talking on the return trip to Mount Vernon. I began to wonder what we had accomplished by going down there. We moved perhaps a couple of tons of debris, a literal drop in the bucket of the estimated 1.2 million tons of rubble. We had saved no lives, only one body had been recovered. Yet for 8 hours, we had been willing participants of a piece of history, something people will talk about long after we are gone. We were the first group of firefighters from Westchester to go down to Ground Zero, but not the last. 2 shifts of Westchester firefighters, Eastchester included, per day responded to the Trade Center site over the course of the next several days. And they also covered in the Bronx firehouses. The only reason this effort was discontinued was the FDNY went to a 24-hour schedule, meaning half their personnel were working at any one time. So they had enough manpower to send to the site and man their firehouses. Whatever needed to be done and whatever we were asked to do, we would not have hesitated on this new day of infamy, September 11th, 2001. The firefighters from Eastchester who responded that night with me were firefighters Quentin Baker, Joe Pinto, Stephen Ranalone, James Rockhill, Ken Simonides, Glenn Strawbridge, Brian Tween, Vincent Spadaro, and William Wigerman. Starting on September 11th and continuing for days, weeks, and months afterwards, ordinary people, organizations, and businesses donated money, food, water, and clothing to victims and rescuers. A couple of weeks later, Local 916, Eastchester, had a Fill the Boot fundraiser at the intersection of Mill Road and White Plains Road and collected over $30,000. in 4 hours for the FDNY Widows and Children's Fund. 1 week after 9/11, an estimated 6,000 people filled the property outside Town Hall for a memorial service with political representatives from Eastchester, Tuckahoe, and Bronxville. The clergy of almost every faith that had membership in the town offered words of blessing and comfort to all. The 3 police departments, fire department, and EVAC were all well represented. Weeks later, the fire department and police department played a charity basketball game. Local 916 sponsored the collation at the funeral for Fire Marshal and Tuckahoe resident Ronald Buca at Concordia College. The Tuckahoe Post Office is named in his memory now. Members attended numerous funerals. Thanks to retired FDNY Captain Bill Spinelli, and as a direct result of our sales of the FDNY 343 hats, George Glover Jr. and I were invited to attend the FDNY Memorial Service held inside Madison Square Garden in October 2002. Although it was a cold and rainy day, about 30,000 firefighters from across the country and around the world marched in a parade prior to the service. It is amazing what can be accomplished when people put aside their differences, get together, and work for the common good. That last sentence was the only good thing to come out of 9/11. It brought the country completely together. It was your political beliefs meant nothing. The color of your skin, your nationality, nothing made a difference. Everybody was one. Unfortunately, that went away too quickly. Of the nearly 3,000 people were killed on that day, including 343 firefighters and 26 police officers. The number of firefighters has almost doubled since that time. The number of police officers is now at approximately 250, and an additional 6,300 people have passed away from 9/11 disease. Last July of last year, I was diagnosed with prostate cancer, and after receiving 45 treatments of radiation from November 30th through February 1st, and 4 follow-up visits in the last year, I'm cancer-free now. Thank you. Unfortunately, people, like I said, are still dying. 2 Eastchester firefighters' names appear on the 9/11 memorial at the Kensico Dam, Vincent Spadaro and Captain Phil Pinto. Captain Phil Pinto responded to one of the Bronx firehouses, and when their engine came back full of dust, they washed it off. And the dust was all around them. They got on their clothes and everything else. And unfortunately, Phil passed away a year and a half ago from cancer. And Vinny Spadaro, who went down with me on that day, he went down, he made numerous trips down there, bringing supplies and everything down there, and he passed away 6 years ago. And he was a longtime friend of mine. That is it. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Andrea Rayner. I was a chaplain to Jansen Hospice at the time of 9/11. I'm a United Methodist minister and served as a hospice chaplain for 20 years. On the morning of September 11th, I was right on Main Street in Tuckahoe with our hospice office. We were going through patients, the report from the night before, who had died, who might need extra help that day, when our administrative assistant ran in and said that a plane had hit the World Trade Center. And like Paul said, we thought, oh, that's really sad. We all pictured a little tour plane kind of bouncing off the tower. We thought, I hope nobody on the ground was killed. And the next, 15 minutes later, she ran in again and said, oh my God, another plane just hit the tower. And I remember the social worker there said, we're at war. And at the time, I thought, well, that's a little dramatic. because we didn't have smartphones, we didn't have a TV there. We just couldn't fathom that our country had been attacked in that way. So immediately we brought in a radio. It was so old school. We were gathered around the radio trying to hear reports about what was going on. My husband happened to be home that day, so I called him and told him to turn on the television and tell me what was happening. And he said he stood there and literally screamed out loud as he watched the first tower come down. So in the days after, my kids were in kindergarten and third grade at the time, and initially we waited thinking that the wounded would be coming into Lawrence Hospital. We were one of those first hospitals outside of the city. So we just triaged, we saw our hospice patients, and then we waited, and we waited, and we waited. And of course, no wounded or dying were coming to Westchester. So I said, I have to go home and see my kids. So I got there about 3 o'clock pickup time. It was like a war zone. I live in Rye now. I lived in Mount Vernon for years. And women were just going, mom to mom, does your husband work at the Trade Center? Have you heard from so-and-so? Do you know who's down there? And we lost about 16 people in our little town of Rye that day, and many more since then. So eventually I connected with a friend of mine whose husband was a bishop to the armed forces for the Episcopal Church. And I said, listen, I really want to volunteer. I figured as a hospice chaplain, I had more intersection with death than a lot of my clergy colleagues, although nothing can really prepare you to see bits and pieces of people, but I felt very compelled to go. So the bishop and I met. He had me take a shift for him. That first night was around October 1st, so a couple weeks after the attack. It was very chaotic at Ground Zero initially, especially with the clergy. People were slipping in, telling people that they were going to hell if they didn't accept Christ as their Savior, that people were probably in hell now. It was horrible. There was no place for that kind of talk at Ground Zero, but people were slipping in for all sorts of reasons. But that first night, I did an 11 o'clock at night till 7 in the morning shift, and my job was really just to walk the perimeter of the site, listen to the stories that the construction workers and the firefighters and the cops were telling about their experience. Some of them had been there when the towers fell, others were there volunteering. There were so many stories, and there were a lot of myths floating around in that early days. Oh, I heard an old guy, he rode down a piece of concrete, 16 floors, and survived. Of course, that wasn't the case, but everybody wanted to hope. Or someone else who talked about hearing screams kind of coming from underground as they were trying to flee the towers as they were falling. So probably every 15 feet, someone would pull me aside and talk to me. I don't normally wear a clergy collar, but I wore one at Ground Zero to separate me from the volunteers and some of the other mental health personnel, because the collar invited a certain kind of conversation. Why did this happen? Why did God let this happen? Why did one person stay home from work that day and the other person go into work? So there were just those questions of meanings over and over again. I had one EMS lieutenant who was just sobbing, saying that, that day he and his partner ran in and they were trying to carry a woman who was pretty far gone down flights and flights of steps. And they were getting towards the bottom. He said she looked like she was maybe even dead at that point, and the building started shaking. And so he said, so we made the choice to leave her there and run, because if we had stayed, we would have all died. But if we ran, there's a chance that we could have lived. And he said, I thought of my 5 kids, and I ran. And he said, I can't stop thinking about that woman that we left there. And so, the idea that we never know what we're going to do in a certain situation. There's no judgment of those kinds of choices that people had to make, but being able to talk about them and unburden themselves with, I think, with clergy at that point, and to feel some forgiveness for the terrible, terrible choices that people had to make was part of my role. As I said, it was so chaotic at first in terms of organizing clergy that eventually the Red Cross took over the clergy. And we had people who were, priests and imams and ministers and rabbis and Tibetan monks. We had every kind of clergy you can imagine who were volunteering. It was November, and we were all meeting downtown to decide where people would like to volunteer. Do they want to be at the family centers? Would they want to be at the hospitality center? Would they want to be at the permanent morgue, which was at Lenox Hospital, I believe? Or would they want to be at the temporary morgue at Ground Zero, where the bodies were being, once they were, or pieces of bodies were found, they were brought into a little trailer. I immediately volunteered for the morgue on site, again, because of my familiarity with death and dead bodies, but I never saw a whole body there at the morgue, which was much different than being with somebody at the very end of their natural lives. But I wanted to volunteer there. While we were there, we heard that the plane that went from Queens that was going to Jamaica had crashed. And so immediately, we didn't know again whether this was a terrorist attack. And so people started triaging who was going to go to the airport to be with families. It was, I can't even quite articulate what an intense time it was, how everyone was on high alert at all times. So in November, I began my shifts at the morgue at Ground Zero. It moved from one little trailer. It was just like a wooden trailer that then moved a little closer to the site. And I did, about every other week, I would do an 8-hour shift. So it might be 11 at night till 7 in the morning. It might be 7 to 3. It just varied. And I might follow a Catholic priest who followed a rabbi. It sounds like a joke, but it really wasn't. And we all just formed this continual circle of blessing remains. Initially, as you can imagine, there were bits and pieces of people that would come in. When it looked like a person of service, maybe a fireman or a police officer was found, if it was clear that was what it was, everything would go quiet. The site, which you can imagine that initially from this intense towering pile, things would go quiet, and then a remain would be brought up to our little trailer in a body bag, kind of come up on what they call a gator, the little four-wheeled vehicles that would bring up the body to us. At the morgue, the crime scene officer would photograph the remains because it was a crime scene. If we weren't sure of the part, the medical examiner would tell us what part of the body this was. Every piece of every person was hand-logged into a book. It was like a travelogue of pain, really. It was the part, the place, the time it was found, the date it was found, all logged by hand into a giant book. And then eventually the clergy would offer a blessing on the remains. You might wonder, what does it matter that we blessed every part of every person, whether it was somebody's arm or leg or a tooth or a piece of tissue? Why did that matter, that we blessed each part? And if you're not religious, then I would only just say this, that we wanted to affirm the sanctity of life, that every person was important, that they weren't forgotten, that it mattered that they died and how they died. And by offering this blessing, not only for those who are spiritual or religious, that we could ask for some grace to surround that family, knowing that somebody would get some bit of closure from their loved one, but also that maybe when we die, someone will remember us. If we succumb to an illness from this work, that we too would be remembered. So it was a very holy time. Grown, men and women, the construction guys would take off their hats. I'd offer a blessing on the remains. Then they would be put into like a refrigerated ambulance there and eventually taken to the permanent morgue for DNA identification. Probably one of the hardest things for me that I saw that really kind of broke me open was one night, and you never knew what was going to happen when they opened the body bag, what was going to be in there. The more experienced firefighters and cops would pass around a little thing of Vicks and say, you better put a little of this under your nose because this one's going to be bad. It's been under there too long, under the rubble too long. often I felt like I carried that stench of decay in my very cells. Wouldn't really leave me that kind of sensory taste of decay. But the really hard one, they were all hard, but one was they had found just a hand with a wedding ring still on it. And hand was pretty decayed, and the ring was literally hanging like by the last knuckle. And I thought how that hand was retrieved from that hellish mess with a ring still barely attached. The care and the tenderness of people who were digging through that rubble with their bare hands sometimes was just astounding. The care to unearth that hand with the wedding ring still hanging, that I thought somebody's going to get their husband's ring back. And that was a miracle. So any little miracle like that, we celebrated. There were some moments there that, of course, because people are, we need to feel some joy. And I think one of the things that kept me going were the rescue dogs there. And I think you probably will see some pictures, I'm guessing, when the museum comes. Initially, the search and rescue dogs were there to find life, right? And of course, no one was found. But then they kind of morphed into therapy dogs. And there were more like golden retrievers coming down and with their little booties to protect their paws. And sometimes in the long hours of the night, you would see these dogs just start to sag. They were trained to find life. And when there was no life, even the dogs you would see their spirits droop. Their tails would go down, their head would go down. So occasionally a handler would be coming and a firefighter or a construction guy would like half bury a buddy in some, rubble that was close on the edge. And the dog would come by and they would sense life and they would dig, 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 dig. And when the person was found, everyone would cheer and the dog's tail would go up and our spirits would lift because we also wanted to find life so badly there. And to realize that the compassion for these animals, that they were trying to help us, that it created this circle of hope and life that was really uplifting, and it meant a lot. I could go on. You never give a clergy a microphone. You guys know that if you've been in church ever. But I will tell you this: that one night there, I was talking to a young Port Authority officer. And he was letting me know that he was present when they believed that one of the remains of one of the hijackers was found. And I guess it was a particular location, whatever. And I said to him, geez, Rudy, what happened when you found the remains of this hijacker? I imagine the firefighters and cops around, just in a rage. I said, was that person like spat upon? Did you kick the body? Like what happened? And he said, oh no, we handled that body with as much respect and dignity as we handled every other body, because we said, this was still someone's son. This was still someone's brother or maybe father. And it kind of blew me away and humbled me that even there, sacred was sacred, regardless of who was doing what. Now, obviously, later, fists were going to be formed, anger was going to build, but in the moment when those remains were found, there was a sense of sacredness. So I was constantly humbled and taught by that time, as well as having a lot of images that took a while to get out of my head. It took about 5 years for me to really start to unlock that. Every time I would drive down the Bronx River Parkway and I'd see a discarded shoe, I was thinking there was a foot in it, or I was thinking that I was smelling decay. I couldn't see an airplane in the sky without wanting to put my hand up and kind of say a prayer that it was going to land safely. About the first anniversary of 9/11, I found out that I was expecting again. I was thrilled. I knew I was going to be kind of an old mom, but I didn't care. But I didn't know my body was a toxic waste dump. And I had a very late miscarriage then in January. And then 5 years later, I was diagnosed with cancer. So it has been a journey, so to speak. In June, I was diagnosed with a new cancer. Just had another infusion yesterday. My husband said, "I wish you'd never gone down there." And I said, "You know, the crazy thing is I would do it again." And I think most of the people, whether it was the Foley brothers or Paul, I think most of us, even given what we know, we would have done it again, because it was a moment in time where the best of humanity met the worst of humanity. And I think that's the thing that we all carry from that evil did not win, that when people came together, it was the very best of who we are. And that's kind of what I carry with me to this day. And finally, if anybody does believe in the spirit world, I would just tell you this. When I first went down that first night in October, I felt like I could physically hear moans emanating from the pile. I felt like as the smoke was going up, I really sensed these spirits going like, what just happened? Very confused, that violence that had just happened. And every night I would pray, just go on home, go on home. We will look for you, we will find you. We will not stop looking until we can find you and give your families peace. And as the months progressed, I was there pretty much from October to the end of the recovery. And well, we thought it was June, but pieces were still being found after that. It did start to dissipate, and there was more of a sense of peace as the time went on. And I just pray that those spirits who were just so shocked about what happened were able to find their way home. So thank you guys for listening, and I just hope that as you see the museum and as you hear these stories, that the best of yourself will be activated as well, because we never know what's going to face us in life. But we know that life is meaningful and it's sacred, despite everything that we bear, despite anything that goes on, that we all have something to contribute to the goodness of the world. And you guys are the hope. You're the hope of the future. So thank you.
I just want to briefly tell you about the Siller family. They're the driving force behind the 9/11 Never Forget Museum. Stephen Siller was a New York City fireman getting off work that morning. He got in his truck and was heading for the golf course when in radio he learned what was happening. So he drove his truck back to the firehouse, he geared up, he went to the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel, which was closed to vehicular traffic. He put on 60 pounds of gear and he ran through the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel, which is 1.9 miles long. And from there, he ran to the Twin Towers, where he took part in the rescue operation with 342 other firemen who were killed that day. The Siller family founded this museum in 2014. It has traveled across the country, and it will go back to California next week to continue to educate families what this tragedy meant to all of us. When you arrive next Tuesday, you will be greeted by two retired firemen who both were active on the day of 9/11. Jim Riley and Bill O'Keefe will guide you through. You will see 9 framed pictures of those killed that day from town, and you will see other framed pictures, such as Danny, who were killed subsequently afterwards. If we have time for questions, we can do that. As you are well aware, at this point, there is still a lot of emotion with all of us when we talk about this. We have time for questions, Andrew? Well, we just appreciate your coming next week. We will be there to greet you, the Rotary Club, firemen, and other representatives from the town, and we look forward to preparing you and teaching you more about the tragedy 22 years ago that is still affecting us. Thank you so much.
All right, so there will be more information forthcoming about your trip next week, but I can tell you it's something that not a lot of communities get to see, and the town of Eastchester, which our school and many of you live within, has really committed themselves to remembering 9/11 and dedicating themselves to ensuring that we never forget the tragedy that we all faced. So I'd like to give one last round of applause for our guest speakers this morning.